June 18th, 1815. A walled farmhouse south of Waterloo. 1,500 British guardsmen watched from windows and walls as a column of French soldiers, thousands strong, marched toward them through the morning mist. The guards checked their muskets, fixed their bayonets, and waited. They knew what was coming. Napoleon himself had ordered this farm taken, whatever it cost. What followed was 9 hours of the most brutal close-quarters combat of the Napoleonic Wars. Hand-to-hand fighting in courtyards and gardens. Musket volleys through windows at point-blank range. French soldiers smashing through gates with axes while guards fought to close them. Buildings burning with wounded men still inside. And through it all, 1,500 guards refusing to break, knowing that if Hougoumont fell, Wellington's right flank collapsed and Waterloo was lost. This is the story of Hougoumont, the battle within a battle, the farmhouse that saved Waterloo, and the moment when 5 men closing a gate changed the course of European history. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into what Wellington himself called the crucial moment of Waterloo. Not a cavalry charge or artillery duel, but a desperate struggle for a single building. Because Hougoumont wasn't just a farm. It was the hinge on which the entire battle turned, and the men who held it proved that courage, determination, and stone walls could stop an empire. But before we get to those burning buildings and desperate gate closings, before we watch guards and French soldiers kill each other across garden walls, we need to understand why Napoleon became obsessed with this farm. Because without knowing Hougoumont position in Wellington's defensive line, you can't appreciate why 1,500 men fought for 9 hours over a few acres of buildings and gardens. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We cover the battles that shaped Britain, the moments of desperate courage, the victories against impossible odds, the days when everything hung in balance. Let's go back to the morning of June 18th, 1815, when Wellington deployed his Anglo-Allied army on a ridge south of Waterloo Village. Wellington had chosen his ground carefully, a low ridge with a gentle reverse slope where he could hide most of his infantry from French artillery. But his right flank, extending toward the Nivelles Road, was vulnerable. If Napoleon could turn that flank, he'd roll up Wellington's entire line. Wellington needed an anchor, a strong point that could protect his right flank, absorb French attacks, and tie down enemy troops that might otherwise outflank his main position. He found it at Hougoumont, a walled farm compound with a chateau, chapel, barns, stables, gardens, and orchards. The walls were thick stone. The buildings were solid brick. The gardens were enclosed by high walls with firing positions. It wasn't a fortress, but with determined defenders, it could become one. Wellington garrisoned Hougoumont with the light companies of the Guards, the elite soldiers of Britain's most prestigious regiments. These weren't ordinary infantry. Guards were selected for height, discipline, and steadiness under fire. They were the best Britain had. If anyone could hold Hougoumont, they could. Wellington gave them clear orders. Hold this farm at all costs. Everything depends on it. Napoleon saw Hougoumont differently. To him, it was an obstacle that needed removing before his main attack could succeed. If French forces could capture the farm, they'd have a base to attack Wellington's right flank. More importantly, Wellington would have to divert troops to retake it, weakening his main line just as Napoleon's Imperial Guard struck. Hougoumont wasn't Napoleon's main objective. It was a tool to disrupt Wellington's defense and create opportunity for the decisive blow. Napoleon assigned the task to his brother, Prince Jérôme Bonaparte, commanding a division of French infantry. The orders were clear: take Hougoumont quickly, draw Wellington's reserves, create chaos on the British right. Jérôme had about 6,000 infantry, 4 times the number holding the farm. It should have been simple. It wasn't. The attack began around 11:30 a.m. French infantry, Jérôme's division supported by artillery, advanced through the woods south of Hougoumont. The guards in the woods outside the walls opened fire, killing French officers and breaking up attack formations. The French pushed forward through the trees, outnumbering the British light infantry, forcing them back toward the walls. The guards retreated into Hougoumont compound, firing from windows and walls as French soldiers swarmed into the gardens and orchards. The fighting was immediately brutal. This wasn't long-range musketry. This was combat at ranges measured in feet, soldiers shooting and stabbing across garden walls, through windows, around corners. The guards held the buildings, the French held the gardens, and the killing began in earnest. French artillery opened fire on Hougoumont buildings. Stone walls absorbed cannonballs, but the wooden roofs were vulnerable. Shells crashed through tiles, exploding inside buildings, killing and wounding defenders. The chateau's chapel was hit repeatedly. The barn took fire. But the guards kept fighting, moving from room to room, firing from every window, making the French pay in blood for every foot of ground. Then came the moment that would define the entire battle. Around 1 p.m., a column of French infantry, led by Lieutenant Legros, a giant of a man nicknamed the Smasher, charged the North Gate. This was Hougoumont main entrance, facing Wellington's main position. If the French could force this gate, they'd flood into the compound's heart, and Hougoumont would fall. Legros and his men attacked with axes, smashing at the wooden gate while guards fired down from above. Splinters flew, wood cracked, and then the gate gave way. French soldiers poured through, 30 or 40 men led by Legros, fighting with savage desperation, pushing the guards back from the gateway. For a moment, it seemed Hougoumont had fallen. But 4 guards officers, Lieutenant-Colonel James Macdonnell, Captain Henry Wyndham, Ensign James Hervey, and Ensign Henry Gooch, saw what was happening. Without orders, they ran to the gateway. Macdonnell, a massive Scotsman, 6 feet 4 inches, immensely strong, grabbed the gate and began pushing it closed. The other officers and several sergeants joined him. French soldiers inside the courtyard fought desperately to keep the gate open. Those outside pushed forward, trying to get through before it closed. The fight became a brutal shoving match. Macdonnell and his men pushing the gate closed, inch by inch, while French soldiers fought to hold it open. Muskets fired at point-blank range. Men stabbed with bayonets through the narrowing gap. And slowly, impossibly, the gate closed. The officers and sergeants then threw the massive wooden bar across, securing it. The French soldiers trapped inside, perhaps 30 men, were killed or captured. Legros himself, the giant who'd broken down the gate, was cut down in the courtyard. The gateway held. And Wellington, watching from the ridge, later said that the entire Battle of Waterloo turned on the closing of Hougoumont gates. It was the crisis moment. If those 4 officers hadn't responded instantly, if that gate had stayed open, French reinforcements would have flooded through. Hougoumont would have fallen. Wellington's right flank would have collapsed, and Waterloo might have been a French victory. Think about this for a moment. 4 men closing a gate. That's what saved Waterloo. Not cavalry charges or artillery duels or brilliant tactics. 4 officers and a few sergeants pushing a wooden gate closed while French soldiers tried to kill them. Sometimes history turns on moments of physical courage and desperate improvisation. What would you have done? Seen that gate broken, French soldiers pouring through, everything falling apart. Would you have run toward the danger? Let me know in the comments. But the fighting wasn't over. Jérôme Bonaparte, furious that his troops hadn't taken Hougoumont, ordered more attacks. Fresh regiments advanced through the smoke and carnage. The farmhouse became a vortex, consuming French troops. Thousands of soldiers thrown at stone walls, defended by hundreds of guards who refused to break. Napoleon had intended Hougoumont as a diversion. Jérôme was turning it into an obsession. More French infantry poured into the woods and gardens. They captured the orchard south of the main buildings. They occupied the formal gardens. They surrounded the compound on 3 sides. But they couldn't break into the buildings themselves. Every window was a firing position. Every door was barricaded. Every corner had guards waiting with bayonets. The French would mass for an assault, charge forward, hit a wall of musket fire, and fall back, leaving their dead in heaps. Around 3 p.m., the buildings caught fire. French artillery, firing incendiary shells, finally ignited Hougoumont wooden roofs. The barn blazed first, flames spreading to the chateau and other buildings. Wounded men, British and French both, lay in rooms that were burning. The guards tried to evacuate them, carrying wounded through smoke and flames while French soldiers kept attacking. Some wounded couldn't be moved. They burned alive, their screams heard across the battlefield. The chapel caught fire, but somehow didn't fully burn. The walls stayed standing. The crucifix survived intact. Soldiers on both sides saw this as miraculous, a sign from God. Whether divine intervention or just lucky architecture, the chapel's survival gave the guards a psychological boost. They weren't just defending a farm. They were defending something blessed, something worth dying for. Despite the fires, despite mounting casualties, despite being outnumbered and surrounded, the guards held. Fresh ammunition was brought up from Wellington's main line. Reinforcements trickled in. Companies from other regiments sent to replace casualties. Wellington couldn't afford to send large reinforcements. His main line was under pressure too, but he sent enough to keep Hougoumont fighting. The battle raged through the afternoon. French attacks came in waves, infantry charges, artillery bombardments, skirmishers infiltrating through the smoke. The guards responded with disciplined musketry, bayonet charges when French troops got too close, an absolute refusal to surrender even when buildings burned around them. Officers and enlisted men fought side by side. Class distinctions disappeared in the desperation of combat. Everyone had the same job: kill Frenchmen and hold the farm. By late afternoon, Hougoumont was a ruin, buildings gutted by fire, walls pockmarked by musket balls and cannonballs, gardens churned to mud and blood, bodies everywhere. French soldiers who died in assault after assault, British guards who'd held to the last. The survivors, exhausted, blackened by smoke, many wounded, kept fighting because that's what Wellington had ordered, and that's what guards did. Around 7 p.m., Napoleon launched his final attack on Wellington's main line, the Imperial Guard's famous assault that the British infantry would break with devastating volleys. While that climactic moment happened on the ridge, Hougoumont defenders were still fighting. French troops, knowing the battle was lost, made one last desperate attempt to take the farm. The guards, knowing victory was close, held firm. The final French assault broke like waves against rocks. By 8 p.m., the Battle of Waterloo was over. Napoleon's army was routed, fleeing toward France, pursued by Prussian cavalry. On the ridge, British infantry advanced in pursuit. At Hougoumont, the guards, what remained of them, stood in the smoking ruins and realized they'd survived. They'd held for 9 hours against odds that should have been impossible. They'd saved Wellington's right flank. They'd tied down thousands of French troops who could have reinforced Napoleon's main attacks. And they'd proven that British guards, given a stone wall and clear orders, would die before surrendering. The casualties at Hougoumont were staggering relative to the numbers engaged. Of approximately 1,500 guards and light infantry who defended the farm during the battle, about 500 were killed or wounded, a 33% casualty rate. French casualties are harder to determine. They attacked in waves, different units at different times, but estimates suggest 3,000 to 5,000 killed or wounded trying to take one farm. That's a ratio of 6 French casualties for every British. Not because the French were poor soldiers, they fought with tremendous courage, but because defending stone buildings against attackers in open ground is a massive tactical advantage. Wellington visited Hougoumont after the battle. He walked through the burned buildings, saw the corpses in the courtyard, examined the gate that Macdonnell and his men had closed. Later, when asked to name the most important action of the entire battle, Wellington didn't cite the cavalry charges or infantry squares. He cited the closing of Hougoumont gates. That moment, he said, decided the battle. Macdonnell and the officers who'd closed the gate were rewarded. Macdonnell received a special prize from the Regency government, £500, and a commendation noting his distinguished conduct. The enlisted men who'd helped close the gate received recognition too, though less spectacular, promotions, back pay, the knowledge they'd done something historic. In the Victorian era, their story would be retold countless times as the epitome of British courage and quick thinking under pressure. But Hougoumont significance extends beyond individual heroism. It demonstrated something profound about defensive warfare. With good defensive positions, determined troops, and competent leadership, small forces can hold against much larger attacks. The guards at Hougoumont showed this wasn't just theory, it was reality. 1,500 men held against 10,000 because they had walls, discipline, and the will to fight. The battle also showed Napoleon's tactical limitations. His plan to use Hougoumont as a diversion to weaken Wellington's main line backfired completely. Instead of drawing British reserves away from the ridge, The attacks on Hougoumont consumed French reserves that Napoleon desperately needed elsewhere. When the Imperial Guard made its final assault, thousands of French infantry who should have supported it were dead or exhausted around a burning farmhouse. Jérôme's obsession with Hougoumont helped lose Waterloo. From a British perspective, Hougoumont became a legend. The farmhouse that held, the gate that closed, the guards who refused to break. Victorian artists painted the scene. Macdonnell closing the gate became an iconic image of British steadfastness and courage. The story was taught to school children as an example of what discipline and determination could achieve. Even today, military academies study Hougoumont as a textbook example of defensive operations. From a French perspective, Hougoumont was frustration incarnate. French soldiers fought bravely, charged courageously, died in heaps, and accomplished nothing. The farm that should have fallen in an hour held for 9. The diversion that should have been quick and simple became a meat grinder consuming division after division. It epitomized the entire Waterloo campaign. French courage and aggression running into British defensive skill and determination, with the British winning because they understood how to use terrain and buildings to multiply their strength. Perhaps the most fitting memorial is what happened later. In 1817, the Prince Regent created a special award for the most distinguished conduct at Waterloo. When asked who should receive it, Wellington nominated Sergeant James Graham, not an officer, not a gentleman, but an enlisted man who'd helped close Hougoumont gate. The prize, £10 annuity for life. It was the first time an enlisted man received such recognition for a single action. Graham's heroism and Wellington's recognition of it symbolized something important. At Hougoumont, rank didn't matter. Only courage and duty mattered. The defense of Hougoumont also influenced British military thinking for generations. It validated the belief that British infantry, properly positioned and led, could hold against overwhelming odds. This confidence would shape British tactics through the Victorian era. From the Sikh Wars to the Crimean War to colonial campaigns across the empire, British commanders, remembering Hougoumont, believed that stone walls, disciplined fire, and steadfast troops could stop any attack. Usually, they were right. Waterloo itself ended Napoleon's career permanently. Within days, he abdicated again. Within months, he was exiled to St. Helena. France was defeated, the Bourbon monarchy restored. The Congress of Vienna's settlement, the balance of power system that would keep Europe mostly peaceful for 4 decades, was secured. Britain emerged as the dominant global power, a status it would maintain for a century. All this flowed from Waterloo. And Waterloo, Wellington insisted, turned on Hougoumont. Think about the chain of causation. 4 men close a gate. Hougoumont holds. Wellington's right flank stays secure. Napoleon's attacks fail. The French army breaks. Napoleon falls. Britain dominates Europe. Sometimes, world history really does turn on moments of individual courage. Macdonnell and his fellow officers couldn't have known they were changing European history. They just knew there was a gate. It was open. French soldiers were pouring through, and somebody had to close it. So they did. That's the British military tradition at its finest. Not grand strategy or brilliant tactics, just ordinary men. Well, guards officers, but still, seeing what needs doing, and doing it regardless of danger. The story of Hougoumont deserves to be as famous as the charge of the Light Brigade or the Thin Red Line. It has everything: desperate courage, impossible odds, a moment of crisis resolved by individual heroism, and strategic consequences that change the world. Yet it's less celebrated than other Waterloo moments, perhaps because it wasn't glamorous. No cavalry charges, no dramatic squares, just men fighting building to building, room to room, for 9 hours in smoke and fire and blood. But that unglamorous struggle saved Wellington's army and defeated Napoleon. Within 5 years of Waterloo, British power reached its zenith. The Royal Navy ruled the seas unchallenged. British industry was beginning the Industrial Revolution that would make Britain the world's wealthiest nation. British diplomacy shaped the concert of Europe. British culture, literature, science, philosophy flourished. The Pax Britannica, the century when British power kept Europe mostly peaceful, was beginning. And it began because guards held a burning farmhouse on June 18th, 1815. That's what makes Hougoumont matter. Not just the tactics or the heroism, though both were extraordinary, but what it enabled: the British Empire, the spread of English language and law, the Industrial Revolution that lifted millions from poverty, the relative peace of the 19th century. All this became possible because Napoleon was stopped at Waterloo. And Napoleon was stopped at Waterloo partly because 1,500 guards refused to abandon a burning farmhouse. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the desperate struggles, the moments when everything hung on individual courage, the battles within battles that changed the world, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.